October the 12th, 1941. 3 miles east of Vyazma, Soviet Union. Obergefreiter Klaus Schneider crouched behind the burned-out hull of a T-34, his breath forming clouds in the frigid morning air. The 23-year-old veteran of the Polish and French campaigns had seen his share of Soviet weapons, the reliable Mosin Nagant rifle, the crude but effective PPD submachine gun, the temperamental SVT-40. But nothing had prepared him for what he was about to encounter. Through the skeletal remains of a birch forest, Schneider watched a Soviet counterattack forming. Red Army soldiers, maybe 40 or 50, were assembling in a tree line 200 meters away. What caught his attention wasn't their number, but their weapons. Even at this distance, he could see that nearly every soldier carried the same stubby, drum-fed weapon. His squad leader, Feldwebel Heinrich Müller, spotted them too. "Look at those garbage rods," Müller muttered, his voice dripping with contempt. "The Ivans have given up on real rifles. Those cheap stamped metal toys won't penetrate a winter coat." The laughter rippled through the German position. The weapon Müller dismissed looked primitive, almost comical. A simple cylindrical receiver, a crude wooden stock, a drum magazine that seemed too large for the weapon, and what appeared to be stamped metal parts that wouldn't look out of place on a tin can. To German soldiers carrying precision-machined Kar-98K rifles and expensive MP-40 submachine guns, the Soviet weapon looked like something assembled in a basement workshop. What they didn't know, what none of them could have imagined, was that they were looking at the weapon that would kill more Wehrmacht soldiers than any other Soviet firearm. Within 18 months, that crude stamped metal toy would become the sound of German nightmares. The name would be whispered with fear in bunkers from Leningrad to Stalingrad. PPSh-41, Pistolet Pulemiot Shpagina, Shpagin's machine pistol. The Soviet counterattack began at 47 hours. Schneider's unit opened fire at 150 meters, their disciplined bolt-action volleys dropping several Soviet soldiers. The Russians kept coming, not in neat parade ground formations, but in small groups, using cover, moving fast. At 75 meters, the Soviet soldiers opened fire. What happened next would haunt Klaus Schneider for the rest of his life. The sound was unlike anything he'd experienced in 2 years of warfare. Not the controlled bursts of the MP-40, not the steady crack of rifle fire, but a continuous tearing sound, like fabric ripping, magnified 1,000 times. A wall of bullets swept across the German position with a volume of fire that seemed impossible from individual soldiers. Schneider watched Müller, the man who'd been laughing seconds earlier, perform a bizarre dance as multiple bullets struck his torso in less than a second. The Feldwebel's body armour, his winter coat, his flesh, all proved equally useless against the stream of 7.62mm rounds. He was dead before he hit the ground. The soldier next to Schneider, a 19-year-old from Bavaria whose name he never learned, raised his head to return fire. 3 rounds hit him in the face before he could aim. Another burst swept across their position, kicking up frozen dirt and snow, punching through the T-34's thin rear armour, finding flesh. In less than 30 seconds, 12 of the 18 men in Schneider's squad were dead or wounded. The survivors broke and ran. Klaus Schneider would survive the war barely, but he never forgot that morning. In a 1983 interview for a German military history journal, he described it simply. "We thought we were fighting soldiers. We were wrong. We were fighting a factory that had learned to kill." The PPSh-41 was born from catastrophe. In the summer of 1941, the Soviet Union faced annihilation. Operation Barbarossa had smashed through the Red Army's frontier defences, capturing or destroying millions of soldiers and thousands of tanks and aircraft. The Germans were advancing on 3 fronts, aiming for Leningrad, Moscow and Kiev. Soviet weapons production was in crisis. The Germans had overrun major industrial centres. Entire factories were being evacuated eastward under constant air attack, their machinery loaded onto trains, their workers fleeing toward the Urals. The Soviet Union needed weapons, millions of them, produced quickly by a workforce that had never built firearms before. Georgy Shpagin, a 48-year-old weapons designer, understood the assignment perfectly. Shpagin had worked in weapons design since 1918, but he was no academic engineer. He'd started as a simple gunsmith, learning his craft through practical experience. He understood manufacturing, understood what could be built quickly, understood what workers in provisional factories could actually produce. In 1940, he'd been tasked with improving the existing PPD-40 submachine gun. That weapon worked, but it was too complex, too expensive, too slow to manufacture. Each PPD required 13.9 hours of machining time and cost 500 rubles to produce. The Soviet Union couldn't afford that. Shpagin started from scratch. His design philosophy was revolutionary in its simplicity. Use stamped metal parts wherever possible, minimize machining operations, design for workers with minimal training, maximize reliability in the worst possible conditions. The result was the PPSh-41, and it was a masterpiece of pragmatic engineering. The receiver wasn't machined from a solid block of steel like German weapons. It was made from two pieces of stamped sheet metal welded together. The barrel jacket, that distinctive perforated cylinder, was simply stamped metal rolled and welded. The stock was basic wood, nothing fancy. The internals were ingeniously simple, just 87 parts total compared to over 100 in comparable weapons. Most revolutionary was the manufacturing process. A PPSh-41 required only 7.3 hours of machining time, less than half that of the PPD. The cost was 142 rubles, less than a third of its predecessor. The weapon could be built in factories that had never made firearms, using equipment that wasn't specialized for weapons manufacturing. But simple didn't mean crude. Shpagin understood that reliability was paramount. The PPSH's chrome-lined barrel would outlast German weapons by thousands of rounds. The simple blowback mechanism was nearly impossible to break. The weapon could be buried in mud, frozen in ice, or filled with sand, and it would still fire. Factory testing included dropping loaded weapons from 3-story buildings. They still worked. The ammunition feed system was genius. The weapon could use either a 71-round drum magazine or a 35-round box magazine. The drum, adapted from the Finnish Suomi submachine gun design, held enough ammunition for sustained fire. The box magazine was simpler and cheaper for situations where volume wasn't critical. In November 1941, as German forces pushed toward Moscow, the PPSh-41 entered mass production. The timing was perfect. The Soviet Union needed a weapon that could be produced in the millions, taught to conscripts in minutes, and used effectively by soldiers with minimal training. The PPSh delivered all three. The first significant combat use came in December 1941 during the Soviet counter-offensive at Moscow. German forces, exhausted from months of advancing, suddenly faced Soviet units equipped with a weapon they'd never encountered before. The tactical implications were immediately apparent. A German infantry squad of 10 men typically had 1 or 2 MP-40 submachine guns for close combat, with the rest carrying bolt-action rifles. The MP-40 had a 32-round magazine and a cyclic rate of 500 rounds per minute, respectable but not overwhelming. A Soviet rifle squad with PPSh-41s could have 7 or 8 submachine guns, each with 71-round drums and a cyclic rate of 900 rounds per minute. The volume of fire wasn't twice as much, it was 10 times as much. Lieutenant Werner Adamczyk of the 1st Panzer Division encountered this reality outside Moscow. His combat diary, preserved in the Bundesarchiv, describes an ambush on December 19, 1941. We were moving through a village, clearing houses. Standard procedure. My point man entered a building, and the sound started. That terrible ripping sound. I rushed to the door. Pavel was on the floor, his entire torso torn open. The Russian soldier was still firing, just holding down the trigger, sweeping the room. 3 more of my men went down before we could react. We threw grenades, killed the Russian. When we examined his weapon, we couldn't believe it. Stamped metal, crude welds, rough finish. It looked like it was made in a tractor factory. The drum magazine was still half full. He'd fired over 40 rounds in less than 3 seconds. Our MP-40s couldn't do that. Our rifles certainly couldn't. That was when I realized we were in trouble. The German military establishment initially refused to take the PPSh seriously. Reports from the front were dismissed as exaggeration or blamed on poor German tactics. How could a crude Soviet weapon be superior to precision German engineering? The answer was that the Germans were asking the wrong question. The PPSh wasn't superior because of better engineering, it was superior because it was designed for a different kind of war. The MP-40 was a specialist weapon, issued to squad leaders and vehicle crews, meant for specific tactical situations. The PPSh was a mass warfare weapon, meant to be issued to everyone. designed to pour out bullets until the enemy was dead or the shooter was out of ammunition. In the frozen forests outside Leningrad, in the rubble of Stalingrad, in the streets of Kharkov, Soviet soldiers learned to use the PPSh's strengths. The drum magazine meant you could fire almost continuously for 8 seconds at full cyclic rate. In close combat, 8 seconds is an eternity. The high rate of fire meant that even poorly trained soldiers could get hits through volume alone. The reliability meant the weapon worked in conditions that would disable more sophisticated firearms. By spring 1942, the Soviet Union was producing 3,000 PPSh-41s per day. The weapon was being manufactured in dozens of factories, from major arsenals to converted automotive plants. The simplicity of design meant that quality control, while never perfect, was adequate. Even poorly made PPShs worked. German intelligence reports from mid-1942 show growing concern. A document dated June 14, 1942, from Army Group Center headquarters noted that Soviet units are increasingly well equipped with automatic weapons of high capacity. Enemy infantry squads are capable of generating fire volumes previously associated with heavy machine gun positions. German infantry tactics, developed against enemies with bolt-action rifles, are proving inadequate. The recommendation was to increase German automatic weapons production. But Germany couldn't match Soviet output. The MP-40, excellent as it was, required skilled workers and sophisticated machinery. Germany would produce about 1 million MP-40s during the entire war. The Soviet Union would produce over 6 million PPSh-41s. The psychological impact of the PPSh was as significant as its tactical effectiveness. German soldiers began to fear the sound. Veterans could identify it instantly, that distinctive high-pitched "bah" that meant a Soviet position was nearby. The weapon's audio signature was unique, faster and higher pitched than German submachine guns, unmistakable once you'd heard it in combat. Gefreiter Hans Decker, interviewed in 1979, described the effect. You'd be advancing through a forest, and you'd hear it. That sound. Your stomach would drop. You knew that somewhere ahead, in the trees or the ruins, there were Russians with those drums waiting. The worst part was when you heard multiple PPShs firing together. It sounded like the air itself was being torn apart. You couldn't tell how many there were. Could be 3, could be 30. All you knew was that stepping into that wall of fire meant death. The weapon earned various nicknames among German troops. Papasha, Daddy, borrowed from the Russian. Knochensee, bonesaw for the sound and effect. Schwarzer Tod, Black Death, though that may be apocryphal. Regardless of what they called it, they learned to fear it. The Battle of Stalingrad from August 1942 to February 1943 became the PPSh's finest hour. In the close quarters fighting through the city's ruins, the weapon's characteristics were perfectly suited to the environment. Engagement ranges were measured in meters. Cover was everywhere. Precision was less important than volume of fire. Soviet defenders, outnumbered and outgunned in conventional terms, discovered that a soldier with a PPSh in a ruined building was worth 5 soldiers with rifles. The drum magazine meant you could fire long enough to suppress multiple enemies. The high rate of fire meant that even glimpsed targets could be engaged effectively. The reliability meant the weapon worked despite the dust, debris, and destruction. Major Joseph Müller of the 389th Infantry Division kept a detailed account of the fighting in Stalingrad. His entry for October 28, 1942, describes an assault on a factory building. We attacked with 2 platoons, 60 men. The building was a ruin, 3 stories, completely shot up. We knew Russians were inside, but not how many. We went in with grenades and small arms. It was a slaughter. They'd turned the interior into a maze of firing positions, all covering each other. Every time we exposed ourselves, the PPSh opened up. The sound in that enclosed space was deafening, physically painful. We couldn't advance. We couldn't retreat without taking more casualties. We finally called in artillery, collapsed the whole building. When we dug through the rubble, we found 8 dead Russians. 8. They'd held off 60 of us for 2 hours. Each one had a PPSh and at least 3 drum magazines. The floor was covered in spent casings, hundreds of them. They'd fired thousands of rounds. If they'd had more ammunition, they'd still be holding that building. That's the weapon that's beating us. Not better soldiers, not better tactics, better tools. The Soviet military understood what they had. PPSh production was prioritized even over some artillery and armor production. Entire units were equipped with nothing but PPShs and grenades. Tank descent troops, soldiers who rode on the outside of tanks into combat, carried PPSh almost exclusively. Scouts, assault engineers, and any unit expected to fight at close range received priority for PPSh allocation. The weapon became iconic in Soviet propaganda. Posters showed heroic workers building PPShs with captions like, "Every gun kills a fascist." Soldiers were photographed with their PPShs, the distinctive drum magazine clearly visible. The weapon became a symbol of Soviet industrial might and military effectiveness. By 1943, the tactical balance had shifted. German soldiers who'd mocked the PPSh in 1941 were now trying to capture them for personal use. Thousands of PPShs were taken from dead Soviet soldiers and pressed into German service. The Wehrmacht even manufactured its own ammunition in 7.6 25mm Tokarev, the PPSh's caliber, to supply captured weapons. Regulations were issued for the use of captured Soviet submachine guns. German ordnance depots set up conversion programs to modify PPShs to accept MP40 magazines, making resupply easier. Elite units like SS Panzer divisions openly preferred captured PPShs to issued MP40s. A 1943 photograph from Das Reich Division shows German soldiers advancing, and nearly half are carrying Soviet submachine guns. Hauptmann Friedrich Lang, a company commander in the Grossdeutschland Division, explained the preference in a 1944 letter to his brother. "I carry a Russian PPSh. So do most of my men who can get them. Yes, it's heavier than the MP40. Yes, it's less refined. But in a fight, I want that drum magazine and that rate of fire. I've seen what it does. I'd rather have a crude weapon that works than a beautiful weapon that runs empty after 32 rounds. The Russians understood something we didn't. In close combat, the side that can put out more bullets wins. It's that simple." The German High Command was less enthusiastic about troops using enemy weapons, but they couldn't deny the effectiveness. A report from the Inspector of Infantry dated March 1943 acknowledged that captured Soviet PPSh-41 submachine guns are highly valued by frontline troops for their reliability and fire capacity. The weapon's crude appearance is misleading. It is fundamentally sound in design and well suited to Eastern Front conditions. Attempts to produce a German equivalent founded on manufacturing limitations. The MP43-44, later renamed the Sturmgewehr 44, was an excellent weapon but complex and expensive. Germany never achieved the production volumes that the Soviet Union maintained with the PPSh. The numbers tell the story. By 1943, Soviet production of PPSh-41s reached 2 million per year. German production of all submachine guns combined was less than 350,000 per year. The Soviet Union was equipping entire armies with automatic weapons, while Germany still relied primarily on bolt-action rifles. The Eastern Front became a proving ground for the concept of mass automatic weapons. Soviet doctrine evolved to maximize the PPSh's effectiveness. Assault groups, typically 6 to 8 men, would be armed entirely with PPShs. These groups would advance under covering fire, get close to German positions, then unleash overwhelming firepower at close range. The tactics were simple, but devastatingly effective. German defensive positions designed to stop rifle-armed infantry were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of fire. Machine gun nests, the anchor of German defense, could be suppressed by multiple PPSh gunners firing simultaneously. The tactical advantage wasn't subtle. Individual Germaner, soldiers with superior training and sometimes superior equipment, found themselves outgunned by Soviet units that could generate fire volumes previously associated with much larger formations. Private Dmitry Belov, who carried a PPSh through the war from Moscow to Berlin, described its impact simply in a 1975 interview. "Before the PPSh, we were peasants with rifles fighting soldiers with machine guns. After the PPSh, we were soldiers with machine guns fighting peasants with rifles. The weapon made us equal, then made us superior. I never thought of my PPSh as a tool. It was my life. I cleaned it every day, even when there was no water to wash myself. I knew every part, how it felt, how it sounded. In combat, it was my voice. When I pulled that trigger, the fascists listened. The reliability became legendary. Soviet soldiers reported PPShs functioning after being submerged in rivers, buried in mud, frozen solid and thawed, and subjected to abuse that would destroy other weapons. The chrome-lined barrel resisted corrosion. The simple mechanism had few parts to break. The weapon could be field-stripped and reassembled in less than a minute without tools. German weapons inspection reports on captured PPShs noted the crude finish and rough machining, but also noted that the weapons were functional despite manufacturing quality that would be rejected by German standards. One report dated August 1943 concluded the Soviet weapon represents a triumph of adequate design over manufacturing precision. It works not because it is well made, but because it is well designed. The winter of 1943-44 saw German armies in full retreat across the Eastern Front. Soviet offensives, supported by massive artillery preparations and increasingly mechanized forces, were pushing the Wehrmacht back toward Poland. In these battles, the PPSh proved its worth again and again. During the Dnieper-Carpathian offensive, Soviet assault units armed with PPShs would infiltrate German lines at night, get close to headquarters and artillery positions, then attack with devastating firepower. The high-capacity drums meant attackers could sustain fire while advancing, suppressing defenders through sheer volume. Oberst Rudolf Christoph, commanding a regiment in the 17th Panzer Division, described a night attack in January 1944. They came at us around 0300 hours. We had sentries, we had prepared positions, we had clear fields of fire. None of it mattered. The Russians got within 50 meters before opening fire. The sound was apocalyptic. Dozens of those submachine guns firing simultaneously. Our sentries died without getting off a shot. They swept through our forward positions in minutes. By the time we organized a counterattack, they'd killed or captured everyone in our advanced positions and disappeared into the darkness. We found over 500 spent casings in one small area. They'd put more rounds downrange in 5 minutes than we typically fired in an hour-long engagement. That's the reality of the Eastern Front now. They have unlimited ammunition and weapons that can fire it all before we can react. The PPSh's impact extended beyond tactical engagements. The weapon's existence forced changes in German tactics, equipment, and doctrine. Infantry had to advance more cautiously, knowing that Soviet positions could unleash overwhelming fire. Assault tactics had to account for much higher volumes of defensive fire. Even armor tactics changed, as Soviet infantry with PPShs proved capable of suppressing German infantry support around tanks. The production achievement was perhaps more impressive than the weapon itself. Between 1941 and 1945, the Soviet Union produced 679,000 PPSh-41 submachine guns. This was accomplished during a period when the Soviet Union had lost approximately 45% of its pre-war population and territory, when major industrial centers were occupied or destroyed, when the workforce included women, teenagers, and elderly workers who'd never built weapons before. The factories producing PPShs were miracles of improvisation. Evacuated from Western Russia to the Urals and Siberia, often operating in provisional buildings supplied by railways under constant attack, they maintained production through the darkest days of the war. Workers laboured in unheated factories, on starvation rations, producing weapons that would save their nation. Each weapon required approximately 5.5 kilograms of steel, mostly scrap that was melted down and reformed. The stamping process allowed unskilled workers to produce components that skilled machinists would then assemble. Quality control was basic but effective. Every weapon was test-fired before leaving the factory. Defective parts were scrapped and reworked. The manufacturing process was refined throughout the war. By 1943, production time had been reduced to 5.6 hours per weapon. Specialized workshops handled different stages. One area would stamp receivers, another would machine barrels, another would assemble firing mechanisms. The work was repetitive, exhausting, and absolutely critical. Valentina Malakova, who worked in a PPSh factory from age 16, recalled her experience in a 1985 interview. We worked 12-hour shifts 7 days a week. We slept in barracks next to the factory. The food was thin soup and black bread, never enough. But we knew our brothers, our fathers, our sons were fighting. Every weapon we built saved Soviet lives and killed fascists. I personally assembled over 2,000 PPShs during the war. I was proud of everyone. Sometimes soldiers would come to the factory, men recovered from wounds, waiting to return to the front. They would thank us, tell us stories about how the weapon saved their lives. That made it worthwhile. By 1944, the PPSh had become ubiquitous across the Eastern Front. Soviet rifle divisions had thousands of them. Tank and mechanized units were equipped with them extensively. Partisan units operating behind German lines used captured PPShs and PPShs, airdropped by Soviet aircraft. The weapon had become the iconic symbol of Soviet infantry power. The liberation of Soviet territory and the advance into Eastern Europe saw the PPSh's effectiveness in offensive operations. Soviet doctrine emphasized aggressive assault tactics, and the PPSh was the perfect weapon for this approach. Units would advance rapidly, closing with German defenders before unleashing overwhelming fire. The Battle of Bagration in June thus to July 1944 demonstrated the Soviet military machine at its peak. Massed artillery, armour and infantry overwhelmed German defences across a 500-mile front. In the infantry assaults that accompanied this offensive, PPSh-equipped soldiers provided the close-range firepower that allowed Soviet forces to clear German strongpoints quickly. General Heinz Guderian, at the time chief of the German General Staff, later wrote about the Eastern Front in 1944. The Russian infantry had become a different animal from 1941. The same peasant soldiers, but now equipped with automatic weapons that gave them firepower advantage in close combat. Their tactics were simple: advance under artillery cover, get close, overwhelm with automatic fire. We had no counter for this except retreat. The PPSh-41 also saw use in other theatres. The Soviet Union supplied Chinese Communist forces with PPShs during their civil war against the nationalists. North Korean forces in the Korean War used PPShs extensively. Various partisan and revolutionary movements received Soviet military aid that included PPShs. The weapon's simplicity made it ideal for distribution to Allied forces with limited logistics. In the final battles for Berlin in April to May 1945, Soviet assault units fighting through the city streets were heavily armed with PPShs. The close-quarters combat in the ruins favoured Soviet firepower. German defenders, many of them poorly trained Volkssturm militia, couldn't match the volume of fire from Soviet assault groups. General Major Helmuth Weidling, the last commander of the Berlin defence area, described the final days. The Russians came through the city in small groups, heavily armed with submachine guns. Our positions were overwhelmed not by tactics or numbers, but by sheer firepower. They would identify a strong point, suppress it with automatic fire, then assault while continuing to fire. We lost entire companies in minutes. Even hardened SS troops couldn't hold against that volume of fire. The PPSh-41 remained in Soviet service long after the war. Modified versions were used into the 1950s until replaced by the AK-47. The weapon saw action in dozens of conflicts across the globe. Its influence on weapons design was profound, demonstrating that simple, mass-producible automatic weapons could be more effective than sophisticated precision firearms. The comparison with German weapons production reveals the fundamental difference in approach. Germany produced approximately 1.1 million submachine guns of all types during World War II. The Soviet Union produced over 6 million PPSh-41s alone, plus several million other submachine gun types. Germany employed skilled workers using precision machinery to build sophisticated weapons. The Soviet Union employed minimally trained workers using stamped components to build adequate weapons in overwhelming numbers. The German MP40 was a better-made weapon than the PPSh-41. The finish was superior, the machining more precise, the design more elegant. But the PPSh was the better weapon for total war. It could be built faster, cheaper, in greater numbers, by less skilled workers. It was reliable enough for the conditions it would face. Its capacity and rate of fire gave its users a tactical advantage. Post-war analysis by Western military experts examined the PPSh phenomenon. A US Army Ordnance study from 1946 concluded the Soviet PPSh-41 represents a successful balance of manufacturing expedience and tactical effectiveness. While crude by Western standards, the weapon fulfilled its design requirements admirably. The sheer scale of production and deployment gave Soviet forces a significant advantage in close-quarter combat throughout the war. The study recommended that future US submachine gun designs incorporate lessons from the PPSh, including higher capacity magazines, chrome-lined barrels for durability, and simplified manufacturing processes. These recommendations influenced post-war American small arms development. The human cost of the PPSH's effectiveness can only be estimated. German casualty records from the Eastern Front don't specify weapons that cause specific casualties, but given that the PPSh was the most common Soviet infantry weapon from 1942 onward, and that the majority of combat on the Eastern Front occurred at close range where submachine guns were most effective, it's reasonable to conclude that the PPSh killed more German soldiers than any other Soviet small arm. German veterans' accounts consistently mention the PPSh as the weapon they feared most in close combat. More than Soviet tanks, more than artillery, the PPSh represented the immediate threat to individual survival. The sound alone could trigger panic in inexperienced troops. Even veterans treated the distinctive ripping sound with respect. Klaus Schneider, the soldier who survived that first encounter with the PPSh in October 1941, made it through the war. He was wounded 4 more times, fought from Moscow to the Carpathians, and surrendered to Soviet forces in April 1945. After his release from a POW camp in 1949, he returned to Germany and rarely spoke about his experiences. In 1983, a researcher tracking down veterans of the early Eastern Front battles located Schneider and asked him about that morning outside Vyazma. Schneider's response, recorded on tape, was simple. We laughed at them. We thought we were superior in every way. Training, equipment, doctrine. We were wrong. That weapon they carried, that crude stamped metal thing, it killed my friends, my comrades, thousands of German soldiers. Not because the Russians were better soldiers, but because they had a better tool. We spent the war trying to match their production, their numbers. We failed. That weapon beat us. Not the Russian winter, not the numbers, not the factories in the Urals, that ugly submachine gun with the drum magazine. Every time I close my eyes, I hear it. That terrible ripping sound. The sound of Germany losing the war, one burst at a time. The PPSh-41 wasn't the most sophisticated weapon of World War II. It wasn't the most accurate, the most powerful, or the most elegant, but it may have been the most effective. It was designed for the reality of industrial total war, mass production, minimal training, maximum effectiveness. It turned the Soviet Union's advantages, vast resources, huge population, industrial capacity into tactical superiority at the point of contact. The weapon that German soldiers laughed at in 1941 buried them by 1945. The factory that learned to kill had spoken, and the cost was measured in millions of lives. In museums across the former Soviet Union, PPSh-41s are displayed with reverence. They represent not just a weapon, but a symbol of Soviet survival and victory. The crude stamped metal, the simple wooden stock, the distinctive drum magazine, these elements combine into something that transcends mere firearms history. The PPSh was the voice of Soviet industrial might, the sound of determination, the instrument of liberation. And for the German soldiers who faced it across frozen fields, ruined cities, and blood-soaked forests, it was the sound of their own destruction. The laughter had died at Vyazma in October 1941. By May 1945, there was only silence, and the memory of that terrible ripping sound that had torn apart the Wehrmacht one burst at a time. The Soviet understanding of the PPSH's psychological impact led to deliberate tactical innovations designed to maximize terror. One particularly effective technique, developed during the Stalingrad fighting and refined throughout 1943, became known as the drumfire assault. Soviet assault groups would position themselves within 50 meters of German positions under cover of darkness or smoke. On signal, every soldier would open fire simultaneously with their PPShs, not at specific targets, but in a sweeping pattern across the entire enemy position. The combined sound of 20 or 30 PPSs firing at maximum cyclic rate, pouring out over 15,000 rounds per minute collectively, created an auditory and physical effect that shattered German defensive cohesion. Lieutenant Otto Carius, the famous German tank ace who also fought as infantry, described experiencing a drumfire assault in early 1943 near Leningrad. The noise was indescribable, not gunfire as we understood it, but a physical force. The air itself seemed to vibrate. Bullets were hitting everything, every one. The log walls of our bunker were being chewed apart. Men were screaming, not from wounds, but from pure terror. The Russians weren't aiming. They didn't need to. They just held down their triggers and swept their weapons back and forth. In 20 seconds, they'd fired more rounds than our entire company would fire in a day. When they stopped to reload, half our men were casualties and the rest were too shaken to fight effectively. They walked through our position like they were strolling through a park, shooting anyone who moved. We'd been trained to fight soldiers. These weren't soldiers, they were a human wave of automatic weapons fire. The PPSH's effectiveness created a strange black market economy within both armies. Soviet soldiers would trade food, tobacco, or favours for extra drum magazines. German soldiers would risk court-martial to keep captured PPSHs rather than turn them into ordnance depots. Entire underground supply chains developed to keep captured Soviet weapons fed with ammunition. A fascinating German document from 1944, discovered in captured Wehrmacht files, details the establishment of ammunition production facilities specifically for captured Soviet weapons. The memo from the Heereswaffenamt, the German Army Weapons Agency, authorized the production of 500,000 rounds per month of 7.62 Kandors and 25 Tokarev ammunition. The justification was blunt. Frontline units have extensively adopted captured Soviet PPSh submachine guns due to superior fire capacity and reliability compared to issued weapons. To maintain combat effectiveness, indigenous ammunition production is required. This represents an extraordinary admission. The German military, famous for its insistence on standardization and proper supply chains, was officially sanctioning the use of enemy weapons because their own weapons were inadequate. More remarkably, they were dedicating scarce manufacturing capacity to produce ammunition for those enemy weapons. By mid-1944, some German units had more PPSHs than MP40s. The 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, supposedly an elite formation equipped with the best German weapons, had photographs showing entire squads carrying PPSHs. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, formed in 1943 from teenage volunteers, was issued captured Soviet weapons systematically because German production couldn't meet demand. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The weapon dismissed as crude Soviet junk in 1941 had become so valued by 1944 that German soldiers preferred it to their own nation's products. The shift represented more than just pragmatic adaptation. It was an admission that Soviet industrial design philosophy, crude but effective mass production, had proven superior to German precision engineering in the context of total war. The PPSH's influence extended into Soviet popular culture during and after the war. Songs mentioned it, poems celebrated it. Soviet war art frequently depicted soldiers with PPSHs, the drum magazine prominently displayed. The weapon became shorthand for Soviet military power and determination. One popular Soviet song from 1943, Katyusha Gets a PPSh, told the story of a female factory worker who builds a submachine gun, names it, and imagines it being used by her soldier boyfriend to kill fascists. The song was schmaltzy propaganda, but it reflected the genuine connection between Soviet civilians and the weapons they produced. The PPSh represented their contribution to victory. Workers took pride in the weapons they built, knowing each one saved Soviet lives. Soviet war correspondent Vasily Grossman, whose writing about Stalingrad became legendary, wrote extensively about the PPSh. In one dispatch from 1943, he described watching an assault. The submachine gunners advanced in short rushes, their weapons chattering. The sound was the sound of liberation, of revenge, of justice. Every burst said, "This is for Leningrad, this is for Kiev, this is for Minsk." The fascists brought murder to our soil. We return it to them 1,000-fold, delivered by good Soviet steel and the hands of Soviet workers. The post-war Soviet Union maintained PPSH production briefly, but the weapon was obsolete by 1947. The AK-47, combining the PPSH's reliability with rifle-caliber power and better range, replaced it rapidly. However, the PPSH remained in service with second-line units, police forces, and allied nations throughout the 1950s. The weapon saw extensive use in the Chinese Civil War. Communist forces received tens of thousands of PPSh from Soviet stockpiles. The weapon's simplicity suited the conditions of that conflict perfectly. Nationalist forces, often equipped with a mixture of American, Japanese, and locally produced weapons, found themselves outgunned in close combat by communist units with standardized PPSH armament. Chinese copies of the PPSh, designated the Type 50, were produced domestically. The manufacturing process was simplified even further, with cruder finishing and looser tolerances. The Chinese versions were less refined than Soviet originals but equally functional. This demonstrated the PPSh design's fundamental soundness. Even built to lower standards by less industrialized nations, the basic mechanism worked. The Korean War saw PPShs in use by both North Korean and Chinese forces. American and UN troops encountered the weapon throughout the conflict. US military intelligence reports from Korea noted the prevalence of Soviet submachine guns and their effectiveness in the close-quarters combat common in Korean terrain. One Marine Corps after-action report from late 1950 described a night attack by Chinese forces. The enemy approached to within grenade range before opening fire. The volume of automatic weapons fire was intense, unlike anything encountered in previous actions. Gumated 40 to 50 enemy submachine guns firing simultaneously. Our positions were nearly overrun before artillery support broke up the attack. The weapon appears to be the Soviet PPSh, drum-fed, high rate of fire. Extremely effective in close range, assault tactics. The PPSh's globe-spanning influence continued through the Cold War. Soviet military aid packages to Allied nations, revolutionary movements, and friendly governments included PPShs by the tens of thousands. The weapon appeared in conflicts across Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. Each appearance demonstrated the same characteristics: crude but reliable, simple but effective, devastating in close combat. In Vietnam, both Viet Minh forces against the French and later Viet Cong against the Americans used PPShs. The weapon's reliability in tropical conditions, its ability to function when caked with mud or soaked with water, made it ideal for jungle warfare. American soldiers encountering PPShs in Vietnam noted the same characteristics German soldiers had noted 20 years earlier. The distinctive sound, the high rate of fire, the devastating effect at close range. The technological lineage from the PPSh to modern weapons is clear. The AK-47's design incorporated lessons learned from PPSh production and use. Stamped metal construction, chrome-lined barrels, simple mechanisms, prioritization of reliability over precision. These PPSh characteristics became defining features of Soviet and later Russian small arms design. The philosophical approach originated with the PPSh, that adequate weapons in sufficient quantity defeat superior weapons in limited numbers, became doctrine not just for the Soviet Union, but for military forces worldwide. The American M16, despite being a very different weapon technologically, reflected similar thinking about equipping entire armies with automatic weapons. The German experience with the PPSh influenced their post-war military as well. The Bundeswehr, formed in 1955, emphasized automatic weapons much more heavily than the Wehrmacht had. The standard West German infantry squad included multiple automatic weapons as standard, not as specialist additions. The lessons learned from facing PPSh-equipped Soviet infantry had been absorbed. Soviet veterans of the Great Patriotic War, as they called World War II, maintained affection for the PPSh throughout their lives. At veterans' gatherings, old soldiers would reminisce about their PPShs the way others might recall close friends. They'd debate the relative merits of the drum versus box magazine, compare stories about their weapons surviving impossible conditions, argue about proper maintenance techniques. Pavel Andreevich Gorlov, who carried a PPSh from Stalingrad to Berlin, kept his weapon after the war, hidden away in violation of regulations. When he died in 1987, his family found it wrapped in oiled cloth, disassembled, carefully preserved. His daughter recalled that her father would occasionally take it out, reassemble it, check the mechanism, then carefully put it away again. He never explained why. He didn't need to. That weapon had kept him alive through 3 years of the most brutal warfare in human history. The German veterans' relationship with the PPSh was more complex. The weapon represented their defeat, the physical manifestation of Soviet industrial superiority. Yet many also respected it, recognized its effectiveness, understood that it had been the right tool for the war the Soviets needed to fight. In the 1970s and 1980s, as East-West tensions relaxed slightly, and veterans from both sides began to communicate more openly, fascinating exchanges occurred. German veterans would write to Soviet veterans, asking technical questions about the PPSh, discussing tactics, sharing perspectives. These exchanges revealed a complicated mixture of respect, fear, and grudging admiration. One such letter, from a former Wehrmacht soldier to a former Red Army soldier, both men in their 60s, is preserved in a German military archive. You asked what we thought of your PPSh. I will tell you honestly, we feared it. Not in the abstract way we feared your artillery or your tanks, but personally, immediately. When we heard that sound, we knew Soviet infantry was close and we were in danger. I captured one in late 1942 and carried it until I was wounded in 1944. It saved my life more than once. It was crude compared to our weapons, but it worked when nothing else did. I put it in a river, it dried out and fired. I dropped it from a truck, picked it up and it fired. I went 3 weeks without cleaning it properly and it still fired. Your designers understood something ours didn't. In war, a weapon that works is better than a weapon that is perfect. Your PPSh worked. Always. That reliability, that magazine capacity, that rate of fire, these things killed many of my friends. But when I carried one, those same qualities kept me alive. I hated that weapon and loved it in equal measure. Modern firearms historians and collectors have rehabilitated the PPSh's reputation. Once dismissed in the West as crude Soviet engineering, the weapon is now recognized as a masterpiece of practical design. Original Soviet-made PPShs in good condition command high prices on the collector market. The design has been analyzed in engineering schools as an example of excellent cost-benefit optimization in manufacturing. The specific innovations that made the PPSh effective have been studied extensively. The chrome-lined barrel, considered an expensive luxury in 1941, is now standard in military weapons worldwide because it dramatically extends barrel life. The stamped metal construction, dismissed as cheap and crude, is now the dominant manufacturing method for military firearms because it allows rapid mass production. The high-capacity magazine, considered excessive in 1941, is now common because combat experience proved that volume of fire matters enormously. Each of these features was controversial when Georgy Shpagin incorporated them into his design. Each proved correct. The PPSh was ahead of its time in understanding what a military weapon needed to be, not a precision instrument for sporting competition, but a tool for killing efficiently under terrible conditions built in quantities that matched the scale of industrial warfare. The final production numbers tell the story more clearly than words. 6,000 Zeus 79,000 PPSh-41 submachine guns built between 1941 and 1945, an average of 4,157 per day, every day, for 4 years. 173 per hour. One complete weapon every 21 seconds around the clock for the entire war. Each weapon contained approximately 87 parts, meaning Soviet industry produced over 528 million individual components for PPShs alone. Each weapon required 5.5 kilograms of steel, meaning over 33,000 metric tons of steel was formed into PPSh components. Each weapon needed a wooden stock, meaning over 6 million trees were cut, processed, and shaped. The industrial achievement represented by these numbers is staggering. This occurred while the Soviet Union was simultaneously producing millions of rifles, hundreds of thousands of artillery pieces, tens of thousands of tanks and aircraft, billions of rounds of ammunition, and everything else needed to fight the largest land war in history. The PPSh represented roughly 2% of Soviet steel consumption during the war, yet its impact on combat effectiveness was disproportionately large. The human labour investment was equally impressive. Each PPSh required 5.6 hours of labour to produce by 1943. Over 34 million man-hours were invested in PPSh production alone. The workers, predominantly women, teenagers and men unfit for frontline service, laboured in conditions that would be considered intolerable today. Unheated factories in Siberian winter, 12-hour shifts 7 days a week, minimal food, constant pressure to increase production. They persevered because they understood what was at stake. Every weapon they built killed fascists and saved Soviet lives. The motivation was immediate and personal. The comparison with German production is instructive. Germany produced 1.1 million submachine guns total during the war, less than 1/5 Soviet PPSh production alone. German factories employed more skilled workers, used more sophisticated machinery, maintained tighter quality control, yet produced far fewer weapons. The Soviet approach, adequate quality and massive quantity, proved superior for total war. This wasn't because Soviet engineers were better, but because they correctly understood the problem. Modern military analysis of World War II small arms confirms what German soldiers learned through bitter experience. The PPSh-41 was one of the most combat-effective small arms of the war. Not the most accurate, not the best made, not the most powerful, but among the most effective at accomplishing its intended purpose, enabling minimally trained soldiers to generate overwhelming firepower at close range. A 2003 study by the US Army Infantry School examined small arms effectiveness across multiple conflicts. The study concluded that in engagements under 100 meters, which constituted the majority of infantry combat in World War II, the PPSh-41 provided users with a significant tactical advantage over opponents armed with bolt-action rifles or lower-capacity automatic weapons. The weapon's characteristics, high rate of fire, large magazine capacity and extreme reliability, proved more combat-relevant than precision or refinement. The PPSH's legacy and weapons design extends far beyond its direct descendants. The entire concept of equipping armies with mass-produced automatic weapons, now universal, traces back to Soviet experience with the PPSH. Before World War II, automatic weapons were considered specialist items for particular roles. After World War II, they became standard infantry equipment. This shift occurred because the PPSh demonstrated that automatic weapons in quantity changed combat dynamics fundamentally. The modern infantry squad, built around automatic weapons with every soldier capable of sustained fire, reflects lessons learned when German soldiers faced PPSh-equipped Soviet infantry and discovered their bolt-action rifles were obsolete. The current global proliferation of assault rifles, submachine guns and light machine guns represents the universalization of the Soviet approach pioneered with the PPSH. Every modern military has concluded that adequate automatic weapons in sufficient numbers beat excellent individual weapons in limited quantities. This seems obvious now, but it was revolutionary in 1941. The PPSH proved it through the most rigorous testing possible. Combat against the most professional military force in the world at that time. The specific tactical lessons learned from PPSh combat influenced doctrine worldwide. The emphasis on high volumes of suppressive fire, now standard in infantry tactics, emerged from Soviet experience. The concept of fire superiority, that whoever can generate more effective fire usually wins the engagement, was demonstrated empirically by PPSh-equipped units overwhelming German positions through sheer firepower. Modern combat training emphasizes these principles, but they were learned at terrible cost on the Eastern Front when German soldiers discovered that tactical skill couldn't overcome being outgunned. For the Soviet Union, the PPSh represented something beyond military hardware. It was proof that Soviet industrial might could match and exceed German capabilities. Every PPSh was a small victory of Soviet workers over fascist invaders. The weapon became a symbol of Soviet determination, resilience, and ultimate triumph. This symbolic importance persisted long after the weapon itself became obsolete. In Soviet war memorials, statues of soldiers typically carried PPSHs, not rifles. In Soviet films about the war, PPSHs featured prominently. The weapon represented the Great Patriotic War in Soviet visual culture as immediately as any other symbol. The sound of the PPSh, that distinctive high-pitched rattle, became the sound of Soviet vengeance in popular imagination. German, survivors carried the memory of that sound throughout their lives. In interviews conducted decades after the war, elderly German veterans would still tense up when describing it. Some reported that similar sounds, machinery, motorcycles, certain types of tools would trigger instant anxiety responses. The acoustic signature of the PPSh had been burned into their nervous systems through traumatic association. One particularly poignant account comes from Heinz Kuhn, a former Wehrmacht soldier who emigrated to Canada after the war. In 1991, at age 72, he was at a construction site when workers started a pneumatic drill. Kuhn suffered what would now be recognized as a panic attack, dropping to the ground and covering his head. His son, who'd accompanied him, was bewildered. Kuhn later explained that the drill's sound was similar to a PPSh, and for a moment he was back in Russia, under fire watching his friends die. Nearly 50 years after last hearing a PPSh in combat, the sound could still trigger psychological trauma. This wasn't unique to Kuhn. Thousands of German veterans reported similar experiences. The PPSh's acoustic impact was its own weapon. The Soviet weapons designers who created the PPSh probably never imagined its full impact. Georgy Shpagin, the chief designer, lived until 1952. He received the Stalin Prize for his work and was celebrated as a hero of socialist labour. He died knowing his creation had helped save his nation. Whether he fully understood that he had designed one of the most effective infantry weapons in history is unknown. His design philosophy, adequate performance through superior manufacturing economy, became the template for Soviet and Russian weapons design for generations. Modern Russian weapons, like the A-47 and its descendants, embody the same principles: crude but reliable, simple but effective, designed for mass production and used by minimally trained soldiers. This approach, proven effective by the PPSh, became Soviet doctrine and influenced military thinking worldwide. The American military's adoption of the M16, despite initial resistance from traditionalists who preferred the heavier M14, reflected similar thinking. Lighter automatic weapons in quantity proved more effective than heavy, powerful weapons in limited numbers. The lessons of the PPSh had been learned, even if not directly acknowledged. Today, PPSh-41s remain in limited service with some military and paramilitary forces, primarily in Africa and Asia. These weapons, now over 70 years old, still function. The chrome-lined barrels and simple mechanisms that made them effective in 1943 keep them operational in 2024. Few weapons designs remain functional and in service 8 decades after their introduction. This longevity testifies to the fundamental soundness of Shpagin's design. In Russia, the PPSh occupies a place of honor in military history. The Museum of the Great Patriotic War in Moscow displays PPShs prominently with detailed information about their development, production, and combat use. Russian military historians credit the weapon with significant impact on the war's outcome. This isn't nationalist exaggeration. The PPSh genuinely changed the tactical balance on the Eastern Front. By providing Soviet infantry with automatic weapons in unprecedented numbers, it helped offset German advantages in training, doctrine, and combined arms coordination. The production achievement alone, building over 6 million complex mechanisms during a desperate war for survival, ranks among the great industrial accomplishments of the 20th century. For collectors and historians, the PPSh remains fascinating. Original wartime examples show enormous variation in manufacturing quality, reflecting the conditions under which they were built. Early production weapons show careful machining and good finishing. Later weapons, built as the Soviet Union struggled for survival in 1942 and 1943, are much cruder, yet they all worked. This demonstrates the design's fundamental tolerance for manufacturing variation. The PPSh could be built well or built poorly, and either way it functioned adequately. German weapons, captured by the Soviets, by contrast, often failed when exposed to Eastern Front conditions. Precision mechanisms clogged with mud or seized in cold. Close tolerances that ensured accuracy became liabilities when dirt infiltrated the mechanism. Beautiful engineering became useless when the environment exceeded design parameters. The PPSh, engineered for terrible conditions, thrived in them. In the final analysis, the PPSh-41 represents a triumph of appropriate design. Georgy Shpagin understood the problem he was solving. Soviet infantry needed automatic weapons in huge numbers, buildable quickly by semi-skilled workers, reliable under terrible conditions and effective in close combat. He delivered exactly that. Nothing more, nothing less. The weapon wasn't over-designed. It didn't include features that weren't necessary. It fulfilled its requirements perfectly. This is rare in engineering. Most designs either fall short of requirements or exceed them wastefully. The PPSh hit the target precisely. The German soldiers who laughed at the ungainly Soviet weapon in 1941 had underestimated Soviet design philosophy. They judged the PPSh by German standards of craftsmanship and found it wanting. They failed to understand that different standards applied. Soviet standards prioritized function over form, quantity over quality, adequacy over excellence. In total war, these priorities proved correct. The Wehrmacht learned this lesson over 4 years of brutal combat. Every encounter with PPSh-equipped Soviet units reinforced the reality that firepower mattered more than finish, that volume mattered more than accuracy, that reliability mattered more than precision. By 1945, German soldiers who'd mocked the PPSh in 1941 were trying desperately to acquire them. The transformation from object of derision to coveted weapon took less than 2 years. The sound that had provoked laughter in April 1943 provoked terror by August 1943. And that sound, that terrible ripping snarl of 900 rounds per minute tearing through the air, was the last thing thousands of German soldiers heard. Their final moment accompanied by the distinctive voice of Soviet industrial might, speaking in 7.62mm syllables, delivering a message of vengeance and liberation one burst at a time. The PPSh-41 didn't win World War II alone, but it gave millions of Soviet soldiers the tools to fight effectively, to match German firepower, to prevail in the close-quarters combat that decided countless engagements. It was the sound of the Red Army advancing, the voice of Soviet determination, and the instrument of German defeat on the Eastern Front.